and welcome to Fjord and the She Says event called Easing the Tension in the Me Too era. So thank you for bearing with us while we had technical difficulties. So who has been to a She Says event before? Okay, who has not? There's a lot of hands. Okay, so brief intro about She Says. She Says has been in New York now for 10 years, so it's our 10-year anniversary. Yay! It was founded by Laurie and her best buddy in London in 2007. Yeah. And then she, had to come over to New York because of her husband. So she's like, I'll just start a She Says chapter.
My life story.
I'll just start a She Says chapter in New York. So, but I've worked with Ollie's husband in London for years, and when I moved over, we were stalking. The year after, they're like going, hey, you should connect with Ollie, work on the She Says chapter and do things. So She Says has been around for technically 11 years globally. We have over 40 chapters around the world. Everyone's sort of doing their own thing, but with the mission of what can we do to support women in the creative, marketing, and technology industries and getting them up there. It's not about creating policies or changes, but more or less giving them inspiration to know what they can do with the careers and where they want to take their careers. So I'm not going to go into much detail. I'll pass this on to Natalia from Fjord. She can welcome you guys here. But we're wrapping up our donation drive this week. I'll email those that are on the attendee list. So if you like what you're seeing today, this is what we do. We do a lot of events, very interesting, different formats, panels, workshops, speaker series. We're going to have another big event coming up in June to launch something very new. I'm not going to tell you about that right now, unless I'm allowed to, but it supports our mentorship program that we've been doing for free this entire time, too. So without further ado, Natalia.
So welcome everyone to Fjord, New York. It's very exciting always for us to have people from outside coming in and we can share our space with you and have some great discussions. To let you know a little bit about who we are and what we do, and I won't go into too much detail so we can get to the juicy discussion over here. But we have Fjordians in the room so we can talk to you after we're having more drinks. So we are a design and innovation consultancy which sits inside Accenture, which is a very large management consulting company. Fjord emerged around 2001 and around 2013 became part of Accenture. So we're very, very small at the beginning, and now we are 27 studios around the world. That is all 1,000 of us in Berlin last year, kind of like a Fjord festival event, which we can also talk to you about over drinks, maybe not right now. But in terms of what all of us keep busy with, there's a bunch of different things we do, and different studios have slightly different areas of focus sometimes. But first up, it's helping our clients reform their businesses through some human-centered design practices for business design and strategy. Service design is what New York has historically done a lot of, so if you're interested in that, come talk to us as well. And then product creation, so the tangible digital stuff that goes in the market and you can touch and feel and that kind of thing as well. We can talk a lot more about that, but I won't jump into it now. I mentioned Accenture just to give you a sense of how we fit and what our relationship is. It's like a pink iceberg. So it's not scary, it's a pink iceberg. So Fjord is like the number one at the top. So, we do the human-centered design, the strategy, helping guide Accenture to be thinking in that direction. But below us are all of these enormous capabilities from a technology and platform perspective and also a business perspective. To give you a little snapshot of what life is like in Fjord, New York, I took a screenshot, I think it was today, of our Instagram feed. So we have on the top left our fearless leader, co-founder and co-CEO Olof. We have this thing on Mondays called Monday morning meetings where everyone gathers and a couple of people on the team do a themed breakfast for everyone. It's really fun. So he was doing a Finnish one, which unfortunately I wasn't there. I've got no idea where he was wearing a bathrobe, but maybe
It was breakfast theme, so it was breakfast cereal, and I had cartoons playing, and they were wearing robes. And pajamas, and all the way, you didn't have shoes on, it was just socks, pajamas, and a robe.
So there you go. We had a scavenger hunt as well, and the next one is like a farewell for a colleague, which we're all very fond of. This one, the second row on your right, is like we have a shout-out wall just to thank people for doing good stuff on projects in the kitchen if you want to read it. It's one of our breakfasts, so you get the drift. Who here is from Fjord? Can people put up their hands? So if you have questions, feel free to ask people when you're getting drinks. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Laurie, who will be moderating. Laurie's our global lead for inclusion and diversity, so we're really excited to have her leading the discussion with you guys tonight. Not yet. Okay.
That was it, drinks. That's how we do it at Fjord. Super weird sitting and talking to people and not standing. We're so used to being like up, like Talia was doing. Thank you so much, Talia and Amanda and everybody from She Says. As Talia just mentioned, my name is Laurie Muccino. I'm the Global Head of Inclusion and Diversity here at Fjord. I actually think we have 28 studios now. The slide is like we need to update it every month, it feels like. My role is a fairly new one to me. Before this, I came up through program management, operations, engagement leadership, and people management and mentoring, and that has very naturally led me into my passion area, which is inclusion and diversity. So that's just a little bit about me, but you guys are here to talk to these guys. So I would love to just get started with quick introductions, who you are, what do people need to know about you, and then a little intro into the Me Too movement. What most surprises you or has surprised you about the Me Too movement thus far? A moment, activity, a reaction, something like that. So let's start with you, Maroon.
All right, thank you, Laurie. I wanted to start by thanking Fjord for hosting this. And I'm asking myself, how do I get an invite to one of these breakfast sessions? They sound interesting. And also thank you to Amanda for organizing and Natalia for introducing. My name is Moran Brune. I'm an employment attorney. I've been practicing for about 16 years. So spent some time working on the law firm side and then moved in-house to working for companies and also in doing employee relations. So more of the HR side. Investigating issues, investigating harassment complaints, working with advice and counsel, training, policy work within companies. And most recently, I wrote this book, which is Me Too, a practical guide to navigating today's cultural workplace revolution. And the impetus for that was in October 2017, when the Weinstein scandals broke. Then there was so much discussion around it, and there were so many people who reached out to me within my network asking me, what do you think about this, Moran? Like, is there something that we should be doing differently at work? Either as a alleged harasser, like somebody, how do I make sure that people don't mistake or misunderstand my actions? Or from, women who were saying, look, I've actually sort of experienced this. Am I being too sensitive? What do you think? Like, should I say something? So as I started to write these essay texts and responses and emails to people, then it occurred to me that there was an opportunity to really sort of bring some of my thoughts to scale, and thus this book was born. Yeah, and what's really surprised me most about this movement has been how quickly it's gained steam, right? And the question to me has been, why this moment in time as opposed to any other? And I think that what it's really been is that it was pretty salacious, right? And it was the actors who were involved, the Harvey Weinsteins, the Adam Bennett's, It's the people that we know, like the name recognition. And then what it's been also is people highlighting it, like the Alyssa Milanos and the Selma Hayeks, bringing it to popular culture. Like, who else has had this experience? And just the power. We can't, I think, discount the power of just the women and the men out there who have just told their individual stories and added to that, right? So I think that that's really what has spurred it. And then there's also this interesting backstory that it's not new, that is Tarana Burke, 10 years ago, who first started this movement. So I think that there's also that underlying backstory that makes it that much more compelling and interesting for people, and that really lends power to the movement as people tell their own stories.
Hi, I'm Amy Vernon. Right now I'm working for a blockchain cybersecurity company. Lots of buzzwords there. But I spent 20 years as a newspaper journalist. Over the last 10 years, I've done consulting for a variety of media companies. Last year I was on a project with McClatchy. I did a project with the Museum of Natural History. I worked for a couple of startups, just basically a bunch of different stuff. I kind of call myself, like, my superpower is sort of like engineer to user translation and back again, because I can understand both. So that's my thing. I think what surprised me most also was that it actually took this time. But on the other hand, I feel like there's a different reason, and I'll say it. I mean, frankly, I think it was the 2016 election is the reason why it stuck this time, because everybody was just like, well, what the hell else do we have to lose? So I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone by that, but, you know, I think that, like, for a lot of people, it's pretty much like, it's not going to get any worse, so, you know, whatever. So anyway, there you go.
It's hard to follow, but I'll do my best. I'm Kenny Edwards. I'm the Executive Creative Director at Tribal Worldwide here in New York. So part of DDB Group and part of Omnicom, so, you know, agency, holding company, bigger holding company, kind of a deal. Primarily my responsibility is to ensure that we create communications and advertising that speak to people on an emotional level through digital channels primarily. So I'm one of those kids that grew up kind of digital. We like to say, like, you know, born brand, raised digital. I've been raised on doing a lot of things that are technically not very human, but my job is to reconnect it back to being human and being something that's meaningful for people. I think for me, Me Too, it surprised me that it was such a hard opening up for a lot of people. I think there was a lot of things that were buried, and for me it was just surprising at the depth of emotion involved in it, and being someone that works, you know, in the spirit of trying to find emotions, it was amazing that so many people had to hide so many emotions for so long, and that it's weird for me that it's celebrated in a way as it is, with such a sort of positive feeling for something that is just wrong, you know, to happen to so many people. So that to me is always what strikes me, is it always takes you know, something so powerfully you know, emotional for someone to really get it, and for all of us to really pay attention to something that could be just simple, you know, to understand how we relate to someone. So
hard to come out after that. So my name is Aurélie Harp. I'm French and American now. I'm a human developmental coach and the founder of the Womanity Project, which is, you know it, an organization and a platform that is really looking to understand how we define, or if we define ourselves as a gender, what it means, what does it even mean to be a man, a woman, a transgender, a queer, a non-binary person, like all these labels that we are surrounded by. My background is as well in, I used to be in corporate advertising, then I became a performer, and I've been amazed in the past years by the power of performances and how you can retell your story, and how can that be a tool to really help a society to reconnect and to heal, especially in that moment. What surprised me the most in the Me Too movement, well, there are two things. One is I was very surprised to see the difference of the naming of Me Too in the US. In France, it was call out your pig. It was like very violent, very, I think the anger was even really like almost vulgar. You know, it was even every woman were even like, wow, what's going on? The other thing that struck me was the difference in generation. So first of all, there are so many different stories, so many levels. And to realize, like, where are you in this story? Are you completely in the Me Too. So first of all, I cannot tell you how many, I don't know even one of my female friends that haven't gone through some sort of harassment, and at what level, but I do think as well that it happens to the gay community, to men as well, and as well to the generation where, for instance, my parents would say, well, in our time it was okay to do that. Where the new generation is like, no, it's not okay to be like this. So it's how do we find the right dialogue to not negate what happened in the past and what was the truth for certain people, what is the truth, and how can we reconnect in a healthy way? I guess that's what we're gonna discuss tonight.
Indeed. Okay. Thank you all. And I think I had a whole plan of like top down. Now I'm gonna go bottom up because we all of your responses to the Me Too question had something to do with emotion and polarizing emotions and surprise at emotions. And so I'm gonna start with like a weird one that has a lot to do with emotion, and it's about office romances. So office romances happen, right? We spend a lot of time with our coworkers. We develop a natural affinity for them, and sometimes we want to take it a little bit further. And they've always been challenging to navigate, and you had certain rules, and organizations have rules about it. But I would like to talk and hear from you guys what you think, how people need to change their behavior if they're considering an office romance or if they're in an office romance, because power dynamics have shifted and emotions are higher in the workplace where it used to be emotions are here, work is here, and now they're collated together. And Moran, I'd love for you to kick us off on this one if you would.
Sure. So I think now more than ever that people really need to be very cautious and careful about whether or not they decide to engage in an office romance. That it should really be worth it if you decide to date someone in the office. If this is the love of your life, if you think that you'll never be able to meet someone like this again, then, sure. But ask some questions first, I think, right? Like, one, is there any sort of power dynamic or differential between you and the individual? So if there's any sort of reporting relationship, then really I would have to advise against it, or see if you can disrupt that. So in other words, speak to your HR professional, say, look, we're interested, I might need to move off this team. This individual is interested in moving off the team, but you cannot have a reporting relationship between two people who are dating. There's going to be the appearance of conflict, or there's going to be actual conflict of interest there, right? Where it's going to appear as if there's favoritism, and for other people on the team, other people looking in, it's just going to be problematic. And then if anything goes wrong, then one individual is going to have the ability to influence the performance rating, salary adjustment, etc. of the other individual. So you really have to be very careful about that. And again, it has to really be worth it, where you're willing to change companies, change teams, change functions just to have this relationship. If you're on the same team and your peers, I would say also tread carefully, but it's a little less dicey than obviously the reporting relationship. And I would say if you're on the same team, then also ask yourself whether an argument could be made that there's some influence between one and the other. So if one is more senior than the other but doesn't have the title per se, but later if an argument could be made that this other individual could somehow impact my professional life here. Safest scenario, I would say, is if you're on different teams that don't collaborate with each other, that are on different sides of the floor, or maybe different floors altogether, or maybe in different buildings.
Then it's great.
Exactly. And then also ask yourself some questions around what's your relationship history like? Have all of them gone down in a ball of fire, blaze of glory, or have you had pretty amicable relationships in the past, even after they've ended? Maybe ask the same question of the individual that you're considering dating. Be more probing than you've ever been in an initial sort of dating situation. And also think about, it's unfortunate, but part of the reality I think about of office romance is that you have to really think about what the narrative would ultimately be if things go wrong. So in other words, again, if you're a man, be the best gentleman, in terms of courtship and taking things in steps that you've ever been. Same difference for the woman. And, I don't want to discount, same gender relationships as well. Just really think about what the narrative would be if anybody should ever actually file a complaint against you. You want to be able to have like a really nice, simple narrative. I met this person, couldn't help myself, fell in love, dated, took it in steps, it didn't work out. You want something clean. So I would also say that, like, look, if you're looking for something casual, I would really advise against it for the office. Again, I think that my main point would be make sure that it's worth it, proceed with caution, and then make sure there's an overall a good narrative that you would have if you ever have to explain yourself to somebody, like your HR person, an employment lawyer, or a court.
That's so romantic.
Yes.
Employment attorney.
I should have ended with you. That was so powerful.
How about that dinner?
Any other thoughts on that?
It's somewhat related to that, but actually off something that Aurelie said. I'm Gen X. I don't know how many people in this room are as old as I am. And what's interesting is that sort of like not even boomer, but like my parents who were silent generation. I mean, definitely there was much more of a feeling that was just part of it. In Gen X, it was like very much it wasn't okay, but we had no power to do anything about it. I know people who reported things and like HR basically just took care of the company as opposed to taking care of the people, which is how it was, but I mean, that's how it was. But it was very much not okay. And what I find really interesting now is like, finally, it's like, I knew, editors who, had affairs, not just dated, like had affairs with interns even, with like a 20-year difference in age. And what's really weird, so I was, worked in newsroom, and I remember even at the time though, even though I didn't think it was like okay, I remember thinking, well, God, he's a pig, but he's a really good newsman, which is true. I mean, he was one of the best editors I've ever seen, but God, like, ew, don't come anywhere near me, please, unless you're editing my story. And even then, maybe no, just edit it from over there, please. But it is weird. It definitely has changed. So even in that case, it was like, it wasn't okay, but what were you going to do about it? And it is really, good to see that, people need to think about it, because even if you, as you said, even if you're on the same team, I dated, fellow reporters. I actually married a fellow reporter at one point, a long time ago. And it does create just sort of this weird feeling, and think about it, it's like if you break up with someone, like you've been dating someone for a long time, or you're married to someone for a long time, and then you get divorced, you break up or whatever, your friends kind of have to like split you up, and now you're at work and they're not just your friends, but they're your coworkers, and it's just like, ew. But you know what, it's really not that hard not to sexually harass someone.
Yeah.
It's not.
It really isn't. Which is kind of the amazing thing, because just like avoiding all of this is really easy. It's just don't sexually harass someone. Imagine that. Anyway, sorry.
I guess my reaction to all that is I'm a bit sad to hear that because relationship at one point I defined this way, it's against separation that is becoming a rule. I'm married as well, the coworker over there. And I get
different teams, so don't worry.
No, and I get it, especially like all this idea of depending on the position to avoid the abuse, of position or whatever it is. And at the same time, how do we make things fluid so that it's not becoming this kind of algebra mathematical nightmare to be like, I'm not supposed to talk to you or to have feelings. It's hard to to not, and especially I don't know for you, but me, the more you tell me you're not supposed to do that, the more I'm like, yeah, right. So I guess I do think that as well. It's important to have this conversation in the office to have people talking about it when it's not black and white. It's really to be aware of the situation, but as well, like, then what do? You're responsible. You know the consequences. Be aware as a man or woman now that you have the law that is more on your side, that and probably maybe the people in the position of power have a big role to play on that, to give the example.
Anything to add? Or we
Yeah. I mean, you guys have said a lot of really smart things that I thought of too. But
you should have interrupted and then you got in there.
No. It's my role today is to listen. I think for me, it's really a matter of learning to read the right signals. I think that's something that people in the workplace jump into and make assumptions in certain things, like someone being nice, are they flirting with me, are they doing this? But I think it's taking those reading signals and playing chess, like mental chess with yourself. Like, where does it go? Does anyone win in the end, or does everyone kind of lose in the end? And I think it's just being able to take a situation and calculate that. And it's tough because we don't really want to calculate our lives. We don't want to plot it out. But today you kind of have to. You have to really think about it. You have to think about your social profile and the information that's out there, and you really have to kind of cultivate your future with every move that you make within a corporation or within your own career. So I would just say to people, think about it, and think about where that path could potentially lead you, and if it's worth it.
Yeah. And that actually, it leads me to think about something kind of related is like mentoring relationships between men and women, which I think have been, there's sometimes a stigma if you're, mentoring, if you're a senior man and you're mentoring a young woman and you have a meeting out at a bar where you would mentor a man, it's like, is that a date or is that really mentoring? And I think of it because you talked about a little bit of the mind reading and reading signals, and I think some of the challenges from mentoring relationships is that the expectations are different and the communication isn't clear. How do you guys think? How do you feel about how careful we need to be in interpersonal relationships, whether it's an affectionate one or whether it's a mentoring one, or even if it's just with close colleagues?
I think, to the earlier statement, it's really simple, to avoid. I think you just do that. It's really simple to avoid. I think if you approach every work connection as a single individual, as a potential love interest or hookup, like, you're kind of doing it wrong. It's just like kind of approaching life like everyone kind of owes you like the shot at a relationship, and really have to ground yourself in, like, you're there to work and you're there to do a job, and as a mentor to a mentee, you're there to make them professionally better. So put it through the filter of, if everything is what I'm doing, making them at first a better employee, a better professional, am I guiding their career, am I doing those things, then you should be good to go. It's not that hard.
I would ask too, like, I don't really know if it's necessarily appropriate to, if it's a workplace mentoring thing, like to be taking someone to a bar, even if they are of the same gender, like, that doesn't seem very, mentory to me. If it, and at the same time, if it is very important that young women do have male mentors, because right now, things have changed a lot, but men still hold a lot more power in the workplace, and we can't do it alone. We need those male allies, and it's very important to have male mentors as a woman in any workplace. So to shut the door on that just because of Me Too is is very, is going to harm a lot of people. But I mean, I honestly, I don't really know why you would, if you're mentoring someone in the workplace, I don't necessarily know why you'd go to a bar. I mean, I know people do, but I just, maybe the answer is like, you don't with anybody. Oh.
Yeah, and I agree with those points. I think that there's a name for the phenomenon, right? It's called the Mike Pence effect, where like last year, it was like last year he said basically in a Washington Post article, he said that he does not have dinner alone with any woman who's not his wife. And so it's similar. I'm hearing a lot of men in the workplace, senior men saying, look, I'm just not going to have meetings behind closed doors, or do mentorship or do lunches or dinners with women alone, because I don't want to have some sort of harassment complaint filed against me. And that's problematic on so many different levels, right? It's denying potentially opportunities and relationship building for women in the workplace that similarly situated men would have. It's somehow saying or implying that the woman is the problem, that her very existence, that it's not that, that a guy could act appropriately at dinner or at the bar, wherever it is, and still have the complaint brought against him because there may be some element of her making things up in her mind, or her, bringing fictitious complaints, just so long as there's the opportunity for her to frame one out, a complaint out, rather than having the assumption be that, so long as I don't act inappropriately wherever I am, then there won't be a complaint brought. So, I think that it's okay depending on the company culture. If you go out to bars or the country club or whatever it is, how people socialize, as long as it's consistent. Like, so if a woman were to bring, or anyone were to bring a complaint to me and say, oh, I feel as if I've been sexually harassed, and it's because I went to a bar, I went to dinner, and he did this, and then I just by the very fact that I was invited out to one, or just by the very fact that I was out to dinner, my first reaction would be that in and of itself is not sexual harassment. There needs to be more. And then my next question would be, like, in investigating it or speaking to the senior individual, the gentleman, would be, do you do this with, your male workers? And if the answer was yes, then he's consistent across the board. So it would be, I think that alone would make it hard for, a successful complaint to be brought and substantiated on those bases alone. So I really think that this is sort of, again, sort of a made-up phenomenon that makes the woman, or that makes the complainant, the issue and the problem, rather than the behavior of the individual who's being accused.
Yeah.
And the other thing when I hear that is, it makes me think that when you hear all the Me Too stories, it's a lot of isolation, where you talk to friends, you try to talk to people, nobody listened, nobody heard what. And I do feel as well that if you create a culture within the company where people can speak up, but as well make things clear, when it's like, now telling other people I'm going to have a mentoring session with this person, it's out there, and if there was a problem after that, you can talk about it as well, and really the power of speaking up instead of being in isolation and then having this weird feeling and not knowing what to do with it.
But, and just before, Amanda and I were talking about one particular case where someone was investigated, and this was the only person who brought the complaint, and nothing was found. And it's sort of like what we've seen in all of these circumstances is that there's never just one person, unless it's the very first person, and in which case that person probably isn't in a position of power yet. If you're talking about someone who is, really in a high position of power, and there's one complaint, that's probably the complaint that's not a legitimate complaint. I mean, not 100% guaranteed, but it's a pretty good clue. Because if someone's like reached heights as a male in a company and nobody else is complaining, that's unusual. I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire, basically.
All right, well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit because I want to make sure we answer some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time, and I've already taken you drastically off topic. So in this panel, and I'm sure in this room, we have different sized organizations represented, and every organization probably is ingesting and responding to Me Too in a very different way. And so, Miranda, I'm going to ask you to take this one too. Just because your background in employment law, and you have so much experience across different organizations. What are the differences and similarities that you're seeing among all organizations, whether they're large or small, and how can employees kind of adjust to those differences, or what is kind of just happening and pretty clear and going on everywhere?
Yeah. So I definitely see that there is a rise in the number of complaints, that are being brought, and not just around sexual harassment, but generally, right? Because I think that there's a hypersensitivity now, that there's a heightened awareness, which is good, around employee rights. And I'd say that even prior to Me Too, that there was a movement and a shift towards that, with increasing employee paid leave rights laws and with background check laws that were ban the box, so there was already a movement towards that. And then now I think that especially post Weinstein and now in Me Too, that employees do have this heightened awareness of their rights, so they are complaining more around issues that they see in the workplace, which is a good thing. It's good for companies to have that information and to be able to be self-aware and to look into bad actors so they can self-protect and so they can make the workplace a better place for the employees, right? So I do see that. I think that there is a difference in terms of the ways that smaller companies are handling these situations versus larger companies. Larger companies already have the infrastructure, right? They already have the HR departments and specialists. So employee relations people like myself, who have that focus around investigating and coming to a disposition or recommendation and then taking some action around that. Whereas like a smaller company that might not have HR, or who might have an HR person who's HR/benefits person / administrative assistant / office manager, may not be as well positioned to investigate, a complaint that's brought and to come to a meaningful disposition with good recommendations. So in those cases, my strong recommendation and advice is for them to engage an HR consultant or an ER consultant who can then investigate complaints that are brought, because the stakes are pretty high if they get it wrong, if that administrative assistant / office manager, et cetera, gets it wrong, and there's a good possibility or a strong likelihood that they may get it wrong, right? Because they already have all of these other jobs and that's not their specialty. So, I think that for small companies, at first it may sound daunting, the price and the cost of bringing on ER consultants to investigate complaints. But I think that it's important to keep the big picture in mind, which is that it's still much less costly than engaging someone full-time to do that type of work, especially if they don't have that type of volume, and definitely much less costly than the reputational risk and the litigation costs, right, of actually defending a lawsuit and then paying it out if it is discovered that they didn't properly investigate and resolve issues. So that's my strong recommendation for smaller companies.
So if you're in a smaller company and you want to make a complaint to HR, how would that person want to protect themselves, knowing that that infrastructure isn't in place and that there might be mistakes made? What would be your recommendation?
Yeah, so it may be that the smaller company doesn't have HR, or they might have HR that they don't trust. And so if they can articulate why they have those concerns around the HR department that does exist, then they do have the opportunity to go straight to the EEOC, which is external administrative organization, to complain about the treatment that they've experienced.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that topic? All right. Then we'll come back to culture. So all of us have been job seekers at some point. Some of you might be job seekers in this room today, and you'll go into interviews and you'll get the song and dance and the best version of the company. Of course, that's what the interview is for. But Amy, can you help make us better journalists? How do we dig deeper? How do we find out what we should be looking for? What are red flags and what are signs of health in terms of a company you want to be working for?
I mean, we have more of those tools than ever before. I mean, things like Glassdoor or I'm blanking on the names of others, but there's so many, company review sites now where people aren't really afraid to say what they really think anonymously. And you can kind of tell the difference, like even in reading individual posts, you can kind of tell the difference if you're looking for it between the person who has an axe to grind and someone who actually has a legitimate complaint. I mean, I've read a lot of posts and you, just the way it's phrased and just sort of the emotion that's in it, you can really tell if you're trying to tell the difference between what's real and what's, because someone was pissed off because they didn't get the promotion they thought they deserved or whatever. There's also, a lot of stuff out on social media, and I think again, sort of where there's smoke, there's fire. You see little things here and there. There's always going to be some people who are dissatisfied with any company, and there's little things like that here and there. That's not really a red flag, but if you see a lot of like coded language about the company, or just see a lot of complaints and consistent types of complaints, that's a pretty good clue that there's something wrong there. And if you're job seeking in an industry that you're already in, so I worked at various newspapers over the years, you kind of know other people in the industry. Ask your friends, like, do you know anybody who works at that company? Can you nose around and tell me what people there think? Are there problems there? And people will. I mean, if the people you're asking are actually your friends, or at least someone you're collegial with, they'll be honest with you. They'll call up a couple people and just say, hey, I have a friend who's thinking of working there. There was one job I was really interested in applying for a few years ago, and I pinged a friend of mine who had been there, and she was like, oh, so-and-so, right? And I was like, yeah. She goes, you really need to talk to him before you apply for that job. Because she knew me, she knew him. She's just like, she was in kind of a weird position, but that's literally all she had to say. I was like, okay. And so, so sometimes the person doesn't even really have to tell you specifically if you know them well enough, where you're just like, got it. Okay, I won't be submitting for that job. Or even if you do, kind of what questions to ask when you're in there. And, so as a woman, there have been some times where I've asked, about the leadership. I noticed that it's, all white men or something like that, and I ask about it. And usually that's the last I ever hear from them, and I'm like, well, what a shame.
Selecting out.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Probably.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, in terms of asking the right questions when you're in the moment and you have access to people, it's ask for specific examples of how things were handled or what that process is or what's in place in terms of policy, or are there any programs? Because that's an easy way to read someone in the moment, find out if they can't really explain something to you, then you know that it's not set up, or you know that there's something kind of fishy there, and go with your gut. When your gut tells you run, or your gut tells you, maybe what I heard isn't really what's going on, go with it, outside of having firm data to work with.
All right. So, can the guys raise their hand here? Gentlemen, male people, nice. All right, not too many, but I'm happy to see some. Kenny, you're a man. You raised
Thank
your
you.
hand. And you raised your hand, so I knew. What can men do to engage in the dialogue, and how can they support each other and support women? What are the best ways to help relate to each other and to stay engaged even when it's maybe uncomfortable or you're a little bit afraid to engage?
My advice would be to get more uncomfortable. I would embrace it and run towards it. Because I think the hardest thing to do is to build empathy with someone by staying really far away from it. You have to kind of get into an experience and understand what's happening, be part of the conversation and the dialogue. And, you know, for me, it's tough not to want to connect with people, you know, in what I do, and be able to find out what makes them tick and like how to use that to kind of help enhance, you know, the work that they're doing. So, you know, when you know, this movement really picked up, I said to myself, you know, there's two things that could happen here. You know, I could put up a wall, you know, and just kind of avoid everything, or I could embrace it, you know, and get a little bit uncomfortable. I think listening, you know, and I think it's active listening. I think it's creating dialogues about things, checking in with people. How are you doing? How was this? How was that meeting? How was that? How are you feeling about the way things are being handled on this account or this project or whatever it is? I think creating consistency in that dialogue is also, so asking people and talking to people consistently, whether they're a man or a woman, in the way that you talk about evaluating their proficiency or their skills or what they're doing. That to me is kind of the biggest part of the advice, and probably one of the things that are overlooked, you know, by many people that are kind of terrified of like, if I make a connection, what happens? It's just be consistent. You know, it's a lot easier to say like, hey, this is my expectation from you, than you don't know how I'm going to react, because that creates more fear from people. That probably the easiest thing is just knowing that you're listening to make that connection.
That's a good point. I mean, Brene Brown says, she has a great quote around, it's hard to hate up close. So it's really hard to hate people up close, and so your comment about staying away is really resonates with me. Orle, I think that you're probably have something to say here. It's kind of related to how do you know, we were chatting offline about this, but how do we shorten that distance? And I think the distance now, you have a lot of distance around the us versus them, good behavior versus bad behavior. It's very binary.
Absolutely.
So how do we stay close and keep the conversation positive and move from do and do not, should and should not, bad versus good, into a place of how do we just like be together and learn from each other?
And I do think that for certain people, it's a sort of natural gift to be open and at ease with having daring conversation. For others, it's not going to be. So it's really about how to create the condition for that. And that must, to me, come from the people who have the power to do that. So if you are in the power of privilege, that's how you can be an ally, by creating the environment to be the first one to speak up about that, to
Oh, for a second. Technology pause.
interrupted. No, to create. I'm really kidding. To create the condition really of having empathy, vulnerability, and as well something you said about active listening. That's one of the things about improv that I love, which is really like how to really be present in the moment and to go and understand where the person comes from. And whoever it is, if it's the man, like, it's okay to make a mistake as well. It's okay to ask the wrong question. The worst to do is to not do anything and to avoid the conversation and to lose the momentum. Because to me, right now, we have a momentum. We have this opening. It's very uncomfortable, and I'm with you on that. I think it's very important for people to accept this uncomfortable situation to sick it up, because that means change is happening. And if we stop the conversation right now, it's over, and we go back to the old new. And the one thing I encourage as well is to create conversation when it's, again, to stop people being isolated, but to recreate the we. And to understand that the only way we can change things if we are all on this together, because guess what? The white patriarchy and so on, we all victims of that. Like men and women, we're a victim of this system. And it's time that we really put into action. So it's to not stay at what a level of a light conversation, ticking the box, and oh yeah, it's good with HR. No, to really be serious about it. What does it mean to be diverse? What does it mean to promote women, to promote the minorities, to empower everybody, and to be okay with mistakes? It's totally okay. So here I'm preaching for my own thing. Like I think a great thing about workshops and improvisation is about performing, because it's not something that comes naturally. I do think that as the way we've been trained was very individualistic society, and we sort of have to rewire ourselves to be able to talk a normal way to a human being, and just to say, stop, here I disagree with you, and to be okay with that, or for the other person to say, sorry, I didn't know, or I feel it's unfair that I'm paying for all the pigs out there than when I'm not, when I'm a decent person, and how can I be back to be normal with you? So, yeah, improvisation.
I think that's great advice for all genders, that, you know, getting a little bit more comfortable in speaking up, being heard, listening, active listening. I really love what you said about, you know, we're going to make mistakes, and that's really a powerful message. Piggybacking on that, do the ladies now of the panel have any advice specifically for women as to how to keep those lines of communication open when you might be feeling very angry, or years of maybe angry?
Well, I can speak for all of us.
One thing I would like to add to that first is also that when you see that stuff happening, to say, like, see something, say something.
Yeah.
No, but really, like, just be like, say to that guy, just like, what the hell, dude? Like, why would you even think that's okay? And that is you know, a really important thing. But I think for women, I think very often in the past, women haven't supported other women, because there's been, especially like the higher up you go in any organization, there's fewer and fewer women. So you feel like those women are your competition as opposed to being your allies. And I know that the women who I knew who were a generation ahead of me, who were in the, you know, the highest rungs of power in news organizations, were thought of as even much worse than the men, because first of all, think of like what you had to do and how you had to act as a woman in like the 70s to become like a top person in any organization. So like you kind of did have to be a bitch, because like that's just, you weren't getting ahead by being, you know, the den mother. But I think like we have it, like we still haven't really adapted in many workplaces to seeing each other as potential allies as opposed to competition. And I think we need to get over that too, and just be like, okay, you know, it doesn't mean that you have to support a woman just because they're a woman, but it does mean that, you know, when there is a new, you know, a younger woman who's new to the job or whatever, try to mentor her. But it's a different, it can in some ways be different mentoring. It doesn't have to be mentoring her as a woman, but just, you know, help each other and back each other up in meetings. If you see someone is being man-interrupted, or, you know, or someone else is saying the same idea that they said 5 minutes ago, you know, also speak up. I mean, that doesn't have as much power as a man in the room doing it, but if we're not going to do it for each other, you know, why is some dude going to do it?
I think I agree, and I'm going to say not disagree, but add on that. I do think that it's very powerful to meet women and having a real collaborative environment, because I remember my first years in advertising when I was with women who were like being competitive, and it's so heartening because you don't know what to do, you don't know how to, and all of a sudden to meet other women who are like, I've been there, you're gonna be okay. It's okay to cry, it's okay to to be emotional. By the way, men are too, like whatever. It's very powerful to help somebody. So the other thing I would say is you have to, as a woman, to choose what you want to do, to choose your narrative. Do you want to stay the victim and to be put in that box of the fragile little thing that you cannot be alone in a room, should be protected? Or do you want to change that and call the elephant in the room? Like, just when there is something to, and even to encourage the others and just to say, I don't know, like there is something I feel it's not okay, or I don't know how to deal with that, and ask questions. Ask questions. And there is nothing wrong to ask questions.
I had a boss who was from Brooklyn, he was very Brooklyn. I remember the best piece of advice I've ever gotten anywhere was from him, and because like he was like, the Jedi Matt, he was like, these are not the droids you're looking for, and then we'd have 2 new reporters in the room, like it was amazing. But he could also talk like he was from Brooklyn, which he was, but like he could talk that way, and he could get away with saying things in ways that not just women, but a lot of the men in the newsroom couldn't get away with, because he was Tony, and that was his name. But he said to me, he goes, no, it's not fair. But it doesn't matter because that's not going to change. What you need to do is you need to find the way that you can get things done that work for you. And it takes a while. He's like, I'm lucky because the way I get things done happens to be very me. But everybody is different, and it was just really, it was the best piece of advice I've ever had, because I stopped for a second, because it was just so nice for someone to say, no, it's not fair. Because sometimes that's all you need, for someone to acknowledge that, and then you can get past that. But if no one is even acknowledging that, it's very hard to get past that and to be like, okay, great, now what do I do? But if everybody's like, well, yeah, it's, it's great, you start to feel like you're a little crazy.
I see Amanda standing up, which tells me that we have 5 minutes left. So I'm so glad you wore red today, because I can see you clearly in this room. So I got a whole bunch of questions, but I wanted to see if there were live questions from anybody in the audience.
Yeah, how do you deal with conflict aversion? Like, how do you get over not wanting to, how do you just get over conflict aversion? Because I feel like that's a big, thing in speaking up. Yeah. Where, I know it's wrong, but I don't know, I don't want to, create a conflict. Is there a way of, maybe, thinking about it differently, mindset or something?
Believe it or not, I really hate conflict. I know it doesn't sound like it from the way I'm speaking, but one-on-one, I really hate that. But it just, some of it takes time. Some of it just, you start out maybe talking quietly to someone. Maybe it's someone in HR. Maybe it's just your boss. Maybe it's your best friend, and you go to lunch and you're just bitching about everything. You do kind of have to start slowly, and it's not easy.
Yeah. And you also made the point earlier about bystander intervention. Mm-hmm. So if you notice it, if you see that there's something going on in meetings or on the floor that's inappropriate, I mean, if it's more of the subconscious bias type of issue where there might be interrupting at a meeting, then I think it's fine to just say in the moment, you wouldn't interrupt her if she was a man, would you? And then to, I mean, there's a joking slant to it, but you're calling it out in the moment, calling attention to it, and maybe for the individual who's doing it, they might actually have a moment where they can step back and realize maybe I wouldn't do it if it was a guy. Or you could, stand up for yourself in that same way as well, where it's not necessarily confrontational, but it is highlighting the behavior.
And it's not easy, because I do think as well that there are so many moments when you feel like, oh my God, I wish I had said that. Or I push back at that moment, and sometimes on the moment you don't know how to do it, and it's so important to do it in the moment, because usually that's where your anger, you're right. Whereas when you have to come back later and just say, by the way, you know, either you feel like you're crazy, or you're becoming bitter, or you're losing the point. But it's a training. I think it's really practice, and once in a while practicing with your friends outside. It's not only at work. Like, how many times do you realize that you're interrupted or whatever, and finding your way of saying something.
Write it down.
Mm-hmm.
I would write it down, and if you don't feel like you can address it in the moment, come back to it, because you've written down what happened in that moment, and you can kind of go back and process it, or figure out what the right way to communicate it is, whether it's like writing an email, in person, drawing it out, whatever that is, but you've documented it, that it happened in a way, and I think that's like a really important step that a lot of people forget.
Yeah, and I'd add, it sounds silly, but role play, it's like stupid corporate retreaty stuff, but like actually if you just say the words out loud, it actually does help you gain that memory, that muscle memory to be able to say them more often. All right, any other last questions?
Can I ask?
Oh, yeah.
We had a really heated debate this afternoon about, there was something in the news, in the New York Times this weekend. There was a big kind of Nike scandal going on, like loads of people quit, and they were like injecting policy at Nike, right? Conversely, there was another article about Slack where they're saying, we don't need a head of diversity, it's all about the culture. So my question to you guys is, can we go without head of diversion and policies, and kind of just infuse it on culture, or is it a combination of both? What are your views?
I feel very strongly about this. I think in terms of like having someone as a spearhead is really important, but I think the most important thing is that that person understands the true meaning of what diversity is, right? Diversity isn't just one group, it's several groups coming together in terms of representing and having a voice. So I think it's really important to have someone. Now, if your culture is open enough and everyone communicates and there's a forum, that's great, but there still needs to be someone who's representing that voice that isn't at the table. Because that person probably either hasn't had their opportunity yet to be at that table or hasn't been invited. So someone has to be the one to be that lightning rod to spark conversation around it.
I think it also may depend too on size and the type of company. I mean, Slack is large now, but I mean, Nike is this enormous multinational conglomerate octopus monster thing, and there's no way that you need someone to be watching over that, to making sure that there is as a company. And it's also an old company. It's been around a long time. It wasn't born in an era where that was even something talked about. Whereas a company like Slack is much newer. They have been known to be much better. I tend to agree that there still should be someone sort of, not safeguarding, but just sort of like watching that. But when you're talking about a much smaller, a much younger company where that has been part of them from the ground up, it's not as pressing a matter as definitely for an older company. I would say like any company that's more than 10 years old probably desperately needs that, no matter what their size is. And it's really sad that I'm saying only 10 years, but that's another thing anyway.
And at the same time, it's important to have both as well, because it evolves. There is no one rule that is going to stick forever.
Right.
Situation change, mentality change, gender change. No, but it's true. Like now, I'm sure, maybe in 100 years we might be like, what, gender? Why? Why not? We never know. Or maybe we'll be backwards. I hope not. But it's so it's important that the culture is kind of guided, or somebody to make sure that it doesn't go crazy, but at the same time the culture to challenge as well the authority, because sometimes there is abuse of authority too. It's not black and white again.
All right, one more. I know we had one hand up. Yeah, go for it.
You partly answered it in Annie's question, but I wanted to know from a legal perspective what kind of obligation companies have to both educate all of their employees from junior to management and also kind of enforce it. Because obviously we talk a lot about culture, but I mean the companies have a huge responsibility to educate. So are there legal kind of obligations that they have?
Yeah, so increasingly, yes. So California for a long time has had state laws that require sexual harassment trainings to be done on a corporate-wide basis every other year. New York most recently has passed legislation requiring training to be done when an employee first joins and on a periodic basis, and also requiring certain aspects of their policy, of company's policy, to speak to sexual harassment and to how it's handled. And so that's a trend now, and I think especially with Me Too is going to be an increasing trend that may spread, in other states or cities. Additionally, it's a defense, right? It's called the Farragher-Ellerth defense, where if a company has a sexual harassment policy and an investigatory scheme present in existence that's effective and that they use to handle sexual harassment complaints, then they can affirmatively say that they have that if a complaint is brought, right? So it behooves organizations to have that, and most organizations, definitely complex organizations, do.
All right. Well, we are just about out of time. You'll notice over on the board here this giant word questions. There are Post-it notes next to it. If some of this discussion has spurned more questions than maybe you even came with, feel free to stick them on a Post-it note and put them up there, and we're going to circulate to the panel to email out later any unanswered questions. And then I know what everybody cares most about. But before that, I want to thank everybody for coming. She Says for organizing with us, Talia for making this all happen at Fjord, and of course our wonderful panel who's been so open and honest tonight, even if they don't like conflict and hard conversations. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.